Imagine you wake up one morning and the king has given you 3 days to leave. Not because you committed a crime, not because you started a war, but because you exist. You pack what you can carry. You leave behind your house, your business, your neighbors, you're dead. You walk out of a country where your family has lived for generations, sometimes centuries, and you cross a border into the unknown. Now here is the question that should stop you cold. What happened to the country you just left? And why did this scene repeat itself in England, in France, in Spain, in Portugal, in dozens of German principalities, in city after city across medieval and early modern Europe, not once, not twice, but over and over again, for nearly 1,000 years? What was Europe actually destroying when it expelled its Jewish communities? And why did the expelling countries so often pay an economic and intellectual price they never fully recovered from? If you have ever wondered why history's most repeated act of persecution was also one of its most self-defeating, stay with us, because the answer reveals something profound about how fear, debt, and political convenience can make entire civilizations act against their own interests. Before we go further, if you appreciate history told without myths and without filler, consider subscribing and hitting the like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep making these videos, and it tells us you want more stories like this one. Let us go back to the beginning. Or rather, let us go back to a moment that set the template for everything that followed. The year is 1290. England. King Edward I, known to his admirers as a great lawmaker and to his enemies as a ruthless conqueror, issues a royal edict. Every Jewish person in England, estimates suggest somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people, a small but economically significant community, must leave the kingdom by All Saints' Day, the 1st of November. This was the Edict of Expulsion, and it would stand unrepealed for 365 years. To understand why Edward did this, and why it mattered so much, we need to step back much further. Jewish communities had existed in England since the Norman conquest of 1066. William the Conqueror had actively encouraged Jewish merchants and financiers to settle in England, because they filled a role that Christian doctrine at the time made extremely awkward for Christians to fill themselves. That role was lending money at interest. Here is a fact that surprises many people. For much of medieval Europe, charging interest on loans, what the church called usury, was considered a sin for Christians. Church doctrine, drawing on passages from Scripture and the writings of early theologians, condemned the practice. This created a structural gap in the medieval economy. Trade needed credit. Kings needed financing for wars. Nobles needed loans to survive bad harvests. But who could provide these services without sinning? Jewish communities, operating under different religious law and excluded from most other professions by Christian guild systems and land ownership restrictions, stepped into that gap. They became the financiers of medieval Europe not because of some innate characteristic, but because the surrounding society had systematically closed off almost every other economic avenue to them. This is the first thing to understand. The economic role that Jewish communities played in medieval Europe was largely a product of exclusion, not choice. They were pushed into finance because they were barred from farming, barred from most crafts guilds, barred from owning land in many regions, and barred from holding public office. And then, cruelly, they were resented and eventually persecuted for the very role they had been forced into. But the story is more complicated than simple hypocrisy. The relationship between Jewish communities and the rulers who protected them was, from the very beginning, a transaction and a deeply unequal one. In England, Jewish lenders were technically classified as property of the crown. Their debts, when collected, were taxed heavily by the king. When a Jewish lender died, the crown could seize a portion of his estate. The king was, in effect, using Jewish financiers as a tax collection mechanism. They lent to the nobility and merchants, and the king taxed the profits. It was an arrangement that made Jewish communities simultaneously valuable and vulnerable. Valuable because they generated revenue. Vulnerable because they had no independent political power, no guild, no army, no noble patrons with armies of their own. Their protection depended entirely on the goodwill and financial interests of the monarch. And when that goodwill ran out, or when the political calculations changed, the protection evaporated instantly. By the late 13th century, several forces were converging in England that made expulsion politically attractive to Edward I. First, Italian banking houses, particularly from Florence and Lombardy, had begun offering credit to the English crown on competitive terms. The king no longer needed Jewish financiers as urgently as his predecessors had. Second, Edward had been taxing the Jewish community so aggressively for decades that many Jewish lenders had been effectively ruined. The community that remained was smaller and less wealthy than it had once been. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Edward needed money and political capital. Expelling the Jews allowed him to cancel debts owed to Jewish creditors, debts held by English nobles and merchants, who would be very grateful indeed. And it earned him a wave of popular approval because anti-Jewish sentiment, carefully cultivated by decades of church preaching and social scapegoating, ran high among the common population. The expulsion, in other words, was not primarily a religious act. It was a financial and political maneuver dressed in religious language. Edward got rid of a community he no longer needed, cancelled debts he found inconvenient, and bought himself goodwill. In the short term, it worked beautifully. But here is what England lost. The Jewish community expelled in 1290 took with them not just money, but networks. Medieval commerce ran on trust and relationships. Jewish merchants had connections across Europe, in France, in the Iberian Peninsula, in the Mediterranean trading cities, in the Middle East. These were networks of credit, of information, of trade routes. When England expelled its Jewish population, it severed those connections overnight. The Italian bankers who replaced them were perfectly capable financiers, but they had their own interests and their own loyalties. They were not subjects of the English crown in the same way, and crucially, the knowledge, the languages, the contacts that the expelled community carried, that was simply gone. England would not readmit Jewish residents officially until Oliver Cromwell's era in the 1650s. Historians debate the precise economic impact, and it would be an overstatement to say that the expulsion alone stunted English commerce. But it is striking that England spent the next 3.5 centuries largely absent from the Mediterranean trading world that was generating enormous wealth, a world in which Jewish merchants, expelled from one country, often rebuilt their networks in another and continued to thrive. Now let us cross the channel, because France tells a remarkably similar story, repeated, with variations, multiple times. France expelled its Jewish population in 1182 under Philip II, then readmitted them in 1198 when it became clear the economy needed them. Then expelled them again in 1306 under Philip IV, the same Philip who destroyed the Knights Templar in a similar debt cancellation maneuver. Then readmitted them. Then expelled them again in 1394 under Charles VI, this time more permanently. Each cycle followed the same logic. Expulsion when debts needed cancelling and political capital needed spending. Readmission when the economic gap became too obvious to ignore. And then expulsion again when the cycle reset. What France lost in 1306 was particularly striking. Philip IV expelled roughly 100,000 people. Estimates vary, but this is the most commonly cited figure among historians. He seized their assets, cancelled debts owed to Jewish creditors, and auctioned off their property. It was, in purely cynical terms, a massive asset grab. But the credit markets seized almost immediately. The small-scale lending that Jewish financiers had provided to peasants and small merchants, the kind of local, relationship-based credit that kept rural economies functioning, simply collapsed. Within years, Philip was forced to invite Italian and Lombard moneylenders to fill the gap, on terms far less favorable to the French crown than the previous arrangements had been. The short-term gain had produced a long-term structural weakness. But the story reaches its most dramatic and consequential chapter not in England or France, but in Spain. To understand the Spanish expulsion of 1492, you need to understand what Jewish communities had built in the Iberian Peninsula over the preceding centuries. And the scale of it is genuinely remarkable. Jewish communities had lived in Iberia since Roman times, possibly earlier. Under the Umayyad Caliphate, which ruled much of the Iberian Peninsula from the early 8th century, Jewish scholars, physicians, philosophers, and administrators had participated in one of the most intellectually productive societies in medieval history. The period is sometimes called a convivencia, a coexistence, though historians debate how harmonious it truly was. What is not disputed is that Jewish scholars in this period translated Greek and Arabic texts into Latin, preserving and transmitting knowledge that would later fuel the European Renaissance. They served as court physicians, as diplomats, as astronomers. Figures like Maimonides, the great 12th century philosopher and physician, emerged from this world. As the Christian kingdoms of northern Iberia expanded southward in what they called the Reconquista, Jewish communities navigated the transition with considerable skill. In the newly Christian kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, Jewish administrators, tax collectors, and financiers continued to play central roles. They were, in the language of the time, a community indispensable to the functioning of the state. Then came the catastrophe of 1391. In that year, a wave of anti-Jewish violence swept across the Iberian Peninsula, beginning in Seville and spreading rapidly. Tens of thousands of Jewish people were killed or forced to convert to Christianity under threat of death. Those who converted became known as conversos, new Christians. And here is where the story takes a turn that would shape the next century of Spanish history. Many conversos continued to practice Jewish traditions privately. Some rose to extraordinary prominence in Spanish society, as bishops, as nobles, as royal advisors, precisely because conversion had removed the legal barriers that had previously constrained them, but their success bred resentment. And their private religious practices, real or alleged, bred suspicion. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 under Ferdinand and Isabella, was directed primarily not at Jews, who were still legally protected as a separate community, but at conversos suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. The Inquisition was, among other things, an instrument of social control aimed at a community that had become too successful, too integrated, and too threatening to the established order. And then, in January 1492, came the fall of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia. Ferdinand and Isabella had completed the Reconquista. And in March of that same year, the same year Christopher Columbus sailed west, they signed the Alhambra Decree, ordering the expulsion of all Jews who refused to convert to Christianity. The number expelled is a matter of historical debate. Estimates range from 40,000 to over 200,000 people. The most commonly cited figure among historians is somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000. Whatever the exact number, it was one of the largest forced migrations in medieval history. Among those expelled were physicians, scholars, astronomers, merchants, financiers, and craftsmen whose skills and networks were deeply embedded in the Spanish economy. Many went to Portugal, only to be expelled again 5 years later in 1497. Many went to the Ottoman Empire, where Sultan Bayezid II famously welcomed them. According to a story passed down in Ottoman sources, the Sultan reportedly said that Ferdinand of Spain was impoverishing his own kingdom while enriching the Ottoman one. Whether or not those exact words were spoken, the observation was accurate. The Ottoman Empire received an extraordinary influx of skilled, educated, multilingual refugees who brought with them expertise in medicine, metallurgy, cartography, and finance. Jewish physicians from Spain became court doctors in Constantinople. Jewish printers established the first printing presses in the Ottoman lands. The networks of Sephardic, meaning Spanish, Jewish merchants became one of the most powerful commercial webs in the Mediterranean world for the next century. Spain, meanwhile, had lost something it could not easily replace. The economic consequences were not immediate. Spain was about to receive the wealth of the Americas, which masked many structural weaknesses for decades, but the long-term effects were real. The expulsion accelerated the departure of expertise that Spain needed for the administrative and commercial challenges of running a global empire. The converso community that remained was perpetually under suspicion, subject to the Inquisition, and constrained by the concept of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, a doctrine that excluded anyone with Jewish or Muslim ancestry from holding certain offices or joining certain institutions. This doctrine, which had no real precedent in earlier Spanish law, became a mechanism for social paralysis, directing enormous energy into genealogical investigations and status anxiety rather than productive enterprise. Historians argue about how much this contributed to Spain's relative economic decline in the 17th century compared to the Netherlands and England. The causes of that decline were multiple and complex. But the expulsion of 1492 and the culture of suspicion it entrenched was certainly one thread in a larger unraveling. Now here is the detail that should genuinely astonish you. The communities expelled from Spain in 1492 maintained their Spanish language, a dialect called Ladino or Judeo-Spanish, for centuries. As late as the 20th century, Sephardic Jewish communities in Istanbul, Thessaloniki, and Amsterdam were still speaking a version of 15th century Castilian Spanish. They preserved it like a living fossil, a linguistic monument to a world that had been destroyed. When modern linguists study Ladino, they are hearing echoes of the language of medieval Spain, preserved by the very people Spain had expelled. That is the kind of cultural continuity that expulsion cannot actually erase. It just moves it somewhere else. And this brings us to the deeper pattern that runs through all of these expulsions, the one that historians have increasingly recognized over the past several decades. The communities expelled from one country did not disappear. They moved. And wherever they moved, they brought their skills, their networks, their literacy, their commercial relationships. The Jewish merchants expelled from England in 1290 rebuilt in France and the Low Countries. Those expelled from France rebuilt in the Ottoman Empire and North Africa. Those expelled from Spain rebuilt in Amsterdam, in Istanbul, in Livorno, in Hamburg. Amsterdam is a particularly striking example. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Sephardic Jewish refugees and their descendants played a significant role in building Amsterdam into one of the great commercial capitals of the world. They brought trade routes, languages, commodity knowledge, and financial instruments that accelerated the Dutch commercial revolution. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, one of the earliest in the world, operated in an environment shaped partly by the expertise of merchants whose families had been expelled from Iberia a century earlier. The knowledge did not vanish. It was redistributed, and the countries that received it prospered. The countries that expelled it did not. But we should be careful not to make this story too neat, too purely economic, because that would be its own form of distortion. The expulsions were not just policy mistakes. They were human catastrophes. The people forced to walk out of their homes in 1290, in 1306, in 1492, in 1497, they were not economic units. They were families. They were communities with cemeteries they could not take with them, with synagogues they had built over generations, with neighbors they would never see again. The trauma was real and lasting. The 9th of Av, a Jewish fast day commemorating ancient destructions, became layered with the memory of medieval expulsions. The Spanish expulsion of 1492 fell, according to the Hebrew calendar, on the same date as the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem. Whether that was coincidence or a matter of the decree's timing, it became part of how the event was remembered, as one more catastrophe in a long chain of catastrophes. And the violence that accompanied many expulsions or preceded them was not incidental. The massacres of 1391 in Spain, the attacks on Jewish communities during the Crusades in the Rhineland in 1096, the accusations of ritual murder and well poisoning that provided the emotional fuel for expulsion decrees, these were not just propaganda tools. They were moments of mass killing that shaped the psychology of entire communities for generations. The accusations themselves deserve a moment of attention because they were among the most consequential lies in European history. The accusation of ritual murder, the claim that Jewish communities murdered Christian children for religious purposes, had no basis in fact whatsoever. It was invented, essentially, in 12th century England and spread across Europe with terrifying speed. The accusation of well poisoning during the Black Death of the 14th century, the claim that Jewish communities had caused the plague by poisoning water supplies, was equally baseless and was explicitly rejected at the time by Pope Clement VI, who pointed out that Jewish communities were dying of the plague at similar rates to Christian ones. But the accusations spread faster than the refutations, and they provided the emotional permission that made mass expulsions politically possible. This is a mechanism worth understanding clearly, because it did not end in the medieval period. The pattern of manufacturing a crisis, attributing it to a vulnerable minority, and then solving the manufactured crisis through expulsion or worse. This pattern has a very long history, and understanding its medieval form helps explain why it was so effective and so destructive. By the early modern period, the 16th and 17th centuries, the map of Jewish settlement in Europe had been radically reshaped by centuries of expulsion. The communities that had once been spread across Western Europe were now concentrated in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland-Lithuania, which had become one of the largest centers of Jewish population in the world. Poland's kings had extended relatively broad protections to Jewish communities from the 13th century onward, recognizing the economic value they brought. By the 16th century, Poland-Lithuania hosted what was probably the largest Jewish population in the world, a community that would develop rich religious, intellectual, and cultural traditions over the following centuries. And in the Ottoman Empire, the Sephardic communities expelled from Spain had built thriving centers in Thessaloniki, Istanbul, and Izmir. Thessaloniki today in northern Greece was, by the 16th century, a city with a Jewish majority, a remarkable fact that most people today have never heard. The wealth of intellectual and cultural production that emerged from these communities during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries was extraordinary in philosophy, in law, in medicine, in literature, in commerce. It was produced by communities that had been told repeatedly that they had no place in the societies that expelled them, and it accumulated, generation by generation, in the places that had chosen to receive them instead. The long reckoning with the economic consequences of expulsion began to dawn on some European rulers relatively early. Oliver Cromwell's decision to allow Jewish resettlement in England in the 1650s was driven in part by a clear-eyed recognition that Amsterdam's commercial success was connected to its openness to Jewish merchants, and that England was missing out. Cromwell faced fierce opposition from English merchants who feared competition, and from religious voices who objected on doctrinal grounds. He never got a formal legal readmission. The process was left deliberately ambiguous, but Jewish merchants began settling in London again, and the English government looked the other way. Within decades, the community was established, and its contributions to English finance and trade were significant. The lesson was being learned, slowly and unevenly, across Europe. Tolerance was not just a moral virtue, it was an economic strategy. By the 18th century, the Enlightenment was producing a new intellectual framework that challenged the theological justifications for persecution. Thinkers like Voltaire, Locke, and later Kant argued for religious toleration on philosophical grounds. But even within the Enlightenment, attitudes toward Jewish communities were complicated and often contradictory. Voltaire himself held views about Jewish people that were deeply prejudiced, even as he argued for toleration in the abstract. The path from medieval expulsion to legal emancipation was not a smooth arc of progress. It was contested, partial, and frequently reversed. Jewish emancipation, the granting of full legal citizenship rights, came at different times in different countries. France emancipated its Jewish citizens during the Revolution in 1791. The German states did so piecemeal across the 19th century. Russia never fully did so before the Revolution of 1917. And even where legal emancipation was granted, social discrimination, economic exclusion, and periodic violence continued. The deeper tragedy of this history is not just what Europe lost economically, though it did lose enormously, repeatedly, and demonstrably. The deeper tragedy is what the pattern of expulsion and persecution produced in the long run. It produced communities that had learned over centuries that their safety was always contingent, always dependent on the goodwill of rulers who might change their minds. It produced a psychology of precariousness that was entirely rational given the historical evidence. And it produced, in the 20th century, a catastrophe whose scale dwarfed everything that had come before. A catastrophe that was itself the culmination of centuries of dehumanization, expulsion, and the systematic stripping of rights. The Holocaust was not an eruption of irrational madness from nowhere. It was the endpoint of a very long process, one that had its roots in medieval theology, in economic resentment, in political manipulation, and in the repeated lesson, taught across centuries, that Jewish communities could be expelled, despoiled, and destroyed without consequence. That is the darkest version of the lesson this history teaches. The countries that expelled their Jewish communities did not just lose economically. They built, brick by brick, a culture of dehumanization that eventually consumed far more than they had ever imagined sacrificing. And the countries that chose differently, that chose to receive, to protect, to integrate, built something else. The Ottoman Empire at its height. The Dutch Republic in its golden age. England after the readmission. These were not perfect societies. They had their own forms of discrimination and exclusion, but the choice to include rather than expel produced measurable, lasting benefits in commerce, in science, in culture, in the sheer productive energy of communities that were allowed to contribute rather than forced to flee. History rarely offers clean lessons, but this one comes closer than most. The expulsion of knowledge, of skill, of networks, of human capital, dressed up in the language of religion or purity or national identity, is always self-defeating in the end. The communities expelled carry what they know with them. The countries that expelled them are left with the debts they cancelled, the property they seized, and the slowly dawning realization that they have made themselves poorer in ways that cannot easily be undone. The Sephardic Jews who left Spain in 1492, speaking Castilian Spanish, who preserved that language for 500 years in Istanbul and Amsterdam and Thessaloniki, they are perhaps the most vivid symbol of what expulsion actually accomplishes. It does not erase. It relocates. And sometimes in relocating, it builds something even more remarkable than what was destroyed. That is a story worth knowing. Not because the past is simple, but because the patterns it reveals are not as distant as we might like to think. What do you think was the more powerful driver of these expulsions? Genuine religious fear, or deliberate economic calculation by rulers who knew exactly what they were doing? The historical evidence suggests it was rarely one or the other, and that is precisely what makes it so worth debating. Leave your answer in the comments, I read them, and the best ones genuinely shape future videos. If this kind of history, specific, honest, and willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, is what you are looking for, subscribe to the channel. We do not do myths, and we do not do filler, just the stories that actually explain how the world got to be the way it is. In the next video, we are going to look at how the Ottoman Empire became, for a period, one of the most religiously diverse polities in the world, and what that diversity actually meant in practice, for better and for worse. It connects directly to everything we discussed today, and I think you will find the reality far more complicated and far more interesting than the legend. See you there.